All right, we're live. Whoa. I didn't expect the microphone set. Thank you so much for coming today and for the work that you do. I feel so lucky to be here speaking with all of you this morning, and just to have the chance to meet some of you, learn about what you're doing in the community, and to share my interest in trauma is a tremendous opportunity for me. And thank you so much to Val for wrangling me in and recording me and, you know, all of the exposure that I'm getting. So I really appreciate it. And so what I have planned for us today, we're going to take a break halfway through. I think that's important to know up front, and you can sort of prepare yourself for how long you're going to be sitting here. But I really want to talk about some foundations of trauma, some of the really basic but crucial concepts to understanding how our brains process trauma and how we carry those experiences with us through our lives. We're going to spend some time then looking specifically at how trauma both impacts and how it's been a little bit overlooked in terms of the services provided to individuals with developmental disabilities. We're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care and how that overlays so nicely with positive behavioral support. So the good news for me when we talk about trauma-informed care is not necessarily about learning how to do a whole new acronym. It's about taking what we do and providing this additional lens that gives us more information and more understanding of what we're seeing. So those are my goals for today. I practiced this presentation in front of my pets who had very few questions, and we were right on time. However, there are plenty of things that we can adjust as we go. I have some pauses written into my notes to, you know, invite questions, but please feel free to ask them at any time. I'm really here to learn with you and to share anything that I can to help you, you know, gain the information that you're hopefully seeking. So we're going to do some brief introductions. I know we're a big group, but it's always important to me to just hear people's names and what you do. And so we'll do that quickly. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. We're going to do a little bit of informed consent in terms of how we talk about trauma and a little bit of grounding exercise to start. And then we're going to go right into it, some introductions to trauma. My belief that everything you need to know about trauma you can learn by watching your pet. I'm going to talk about my cat Dewey and what he's taught me about trauma. And then we're going to move through looking at special populations, treatment concerns, and we're going to end up talking a little bit about vicarious trauma in your work and your work with other supportive staff. So if we could just do a quick loop around the room, and I'm just asking for your first names and your professional role. So however you identify yourself, if you're working, it seems like a lot of you are with DDS, just so I have a sense of who's in the room. And we can start on either side. Which side is more eager? All right.
My name is Tiffany Cochran. I work with Riverside Community Care as a behavior analyst consultant in the North Shore.
Great. Thank you.
I'm Catherine Woods. I do the same thing as Tiffany, except in the Merrimack Valley.
Great.
I'm Rachel Shower. I do the same thing as both of them in the Lowell area.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Catherine LaPlante, the clinical director of DDS. Donna Tardif, I'm the transition service coordinator in the Lowell area office.
Okay. Lowell is well represented. Good job.
Good morning. My name is Esteban Pena. I'm a service coordinator at the Lowell area office.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I'm Louise Mayotis. I'm a service coordinator from the Lowell area.
Fantastic.
Hi, I'm Cindy Colson, with the Bedford area office. I coordinate the psychology outreach services and facilitate risk management.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Connie Forrest. I'm a trainer at the Metro.
Hi there, I'm Lisa Dillon. I'm the risk manager for the API program. I'm Daisy Ciamboro, and I do investigations.
I'm Rick Camara. I'm a program monitor, and I'm also the risk manager of the Central area office.
Kay Collette, with the Metro Training Department.
Sullivan, DDS coordinator for our Middlesex.
Angela, I'm with Central West DDS office as a trainer.
Jennifer, and I'm the human rights specialist for the Metro region.
Tom Winans, Director of Learning Development, Central West.
Jennifer Drantling, I'm an autism service coordinator out of the Franklin office.
I'm Leah Hill. I'm the regional autism program coordinator with DDS in the Northeast region.
Michelle Stamboli, I work for the Northeast Quality Office License
Who's my boss, actually?
You better get this right.
Yeah.
Suffering from trauma.
There are tools for you here today.
Ashley McDonough,
I'm Sarah Rockwell, I'm the service coordinator in the Metro North office.
Renee Maliotic, I'm the trainer.
Great. I'm Nina, I work for Regional Employment through DDS. I'm an employment specialist.
Lynn Shiraz, program monitor in the Western DDS. Transitional coordinator.
Judy, I run program monitor at the Milford.
Renee, program monitor in Southbridge, South Valerie Whiting, statewide director of training.
Thank you so much. I'm very new to Massachusetts, so this is a nice geography lesson, so I can, remember where you're all coming from. My name is Elsa. I currently am teaching in the Human Services Department at Holyoke Community College, and I also work in the community as a mental health counselor. I want to tell you just a little bit of my background. My work in trauma, or my interest in trauma, actually started in the late 90s when I was in college, and I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, which is easier to say now that the Celtics Cavs series is over. It was a little risky for a period of time, but I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and so I grew up in Cleveland and attended college actually in Appalachia, which was a striking difference for me growing up in the urban area. And one of the things that I got involved in doing in college was volunteering at a very rural Appalachian elementary school. And I was there to teach Spanish. That's what I was there to do. So teach these adorable little elementary schoolers how to count and how to say their colors in Spanish. And a few months into me doing the volunteer work there, two really significant things happened in the community. One is that there was some sort of an accident in one of the coal mines in the region. I don't actually remember what the impact was in terms of lives, but the bigger concern was that the mine was going to be shut down. And so many, if not most, of the families of the kids that I work with were affected. And the other thing that happened is that there was this huge fire that affected two multi-family homes in this town. And this was, before we were tweeting about things and before we were getting cell phone updates about anything. And so I showed up to teach Spanish. I had some stupid lessons prepared that involved candy because that was my main pedagogical strategy back then. And what I walked into was a very different classroom than the one I'd been in just the week before. The teacher pulled me out and told me what had happened. And I came in and I saw these kids who looked like different people than they had the week before. Some of the kids' behaviors were animated and wild, and a lot of them were quiet and small. And I asked the teacher, well, what should I do? And she was like, well, teach Spanish. So I was like, okay. So I tried to teach Spanish. But there was something very resonant about that experience because the whole town felt this community trauma. And I wanted to understand more about this. So it's the library, and this was my first reader on trauma. This book called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. I see some eyes light up, so I'm assuming some of you have read it. It was written in the early 90s, and it was one of the sort of seminal texts in introducing this idea of trauma to a wider audience, to people who weren't exclusively studying brains. And it resonated so much with what I was experiencing in the schools, but it also resonated with so much of what I had experienced in my own life up to that point. Some twists and turns later in my professional life, I started my training to becoming a mental health counselor, and I started working the overnight shift at a domestic violence shelter. So I would staff the crisis line, I would pick up families at the sheriff's station, I would clean up messes in the bathroom, I would catch 2 hours of sleep on the couch, and I started seeing the kinds of services that were being provided for these families. We also provided services for people who had been charged with domestic violence crimes. We were looking at both sides of this coin. And at that time, those services were really talked about in terms of services for survivors, services for victims, actually, of domestic violence. And the treatment was tailored as such. So people learned about the cycle of violence and abuse, the elements of control, how to rebuild their self-empowerment, how to rebuild their self-esteem. All of those things are incredibly important. But what was not talked about was this core idea of trauma. It really wasn't part of that treatment paradigm at that time. Even in the classes I was taking in my master's program, I took a class on domestic violence, a class on sexual assault, took a class on grief and bereavement, took a class on eating disorders. We were talking about those issues in really important ways, but we weren't talking about this connecting thread of trauma. I went on from that job to work at several other family violence projects, to work in the community jails, all around these similar issues of trauma, before I landed in a job at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, where I worked with survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And it was there that for the first time, people were using this language of trauma. People were starting to whisper this phrase, trauma-informed treatment. We didn't really have a full-fledged idea of what that meant, but we were starting to look at this idea that even though so many things about the different types of trauma people experience are distinct and unique, the impact on the brain is very, very similar. And the reason why this idea started to flourish is because technology caught up with our thinking. We could take pictures of brains. And we had all these pictures of brains of people who came back from combat. And then we had all these pictures of brains from kids who had been neglected. And we had all these pictures of brains for people who had been through disasters. And there was a pattern. And we started to see these patterns. I say we, I was never looking at pictures of brains, but we, the royal we. There was an understanding that there was some sort of impact happening in the brain that connected these things. And so I just jumped in. I started attending every training I could. I remember calling my sister one time saying, I think I'm going to this 4-day workshop on trauma. My sister's like, that sounds awful. 4 days? Like, what are you doing? And I would plan vacations to go different places to try and to hear from the people who were doing this work and reading as much as I could. I brought some of the books that are my favorite ones today that I read all the time, just trying to get a clearer understanding for myself. Also at this time at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center, we were trying to expand our services. We were a free service. People didn't have to pay, and consequently there was a 9.5-month wait list, which feels great when you are ready to make a change, you're ready to get some help, you're ready to make that call, and the voice on the other end of the phone, who was me, because as many of you probably experienced, I was the adult therapeutic services coordinator, I was also the whole department. And I tell you, the wait will be about 9.5 months. We were really interested in doing something about this. And the way we thought we could is by expanding our group services. We've always had support groups, but we needed more. We needed places where people could go. We got some stimulus funds from President Obama, and we were able to hire a few more therapists. And we started running all these different kinds of groups and looking at the needs of special populations that we were not serving. Did that in some partnerships with like the LGBT Center of Cleveland. We were also doing a lot of work with the refugee community surrounding human trafficking, so we had special groups for that. And we were working with the disability services community because that was a community that had previously been completely ignored by the services of the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. And so we started making things up as we went along, and we built this group called the SAFE Group, Surviving and Feeling Empowered. It was a group that started with 6 women who all had survived sexual abuse or sexual assault and had developmental disabilities, and came together to build this first pilot group where we did psychoeducation about trauma, about sex, about our bodies, about safety, with the idea that this is one of the most vulnerable at-risk populations for revictimization. And that group was, to this day, and this was many years ago now, the most powerful thing I've ever done clinically. This is actually an artifact from that group, something that the group made together as this safe place where You know, if they had something really big and scary that they wanted to share but they weren't ready, they could imagine it staying here. At the end of the group, we asked them what they wanted to do with the jar. They said they wanted me to keep it. So now, like 9 years later, I'm really not sure what I'm supposed to do with it, but I keep it safe in the chest in my office.
And don't open it.
I have never opened it. I doubt you can open it. There's a lot of glue and glitter involved in this. So we started offering these specialized services, and the response was tremendous. Our group grew from 6 to 10 to 2 groups, 4 groups, and so we knew that there was a need there. Since that time, I've been working in community agencies, and I also started teaching. I was in Albany, New York previous to this, and I was teaching at a college there where I started a trauma course. And actually at Holyoke Community College next spring, we're offering our first trauma course. And so this has become something that is incredibly important to my professional life, but it's also changed me as a person. The way that I view the world, the way that I view my life, the way that I view my clinical work has shifted tremendously with this understanding of trauma. The concepts are simple, but they are relevant and they're meaningful. And so I hope to share some of that with you today. Nothing I'm presenting today is based on my own research. Some of it is based on my own experience. Everything I learned is from these brave and committed people who put this information out about trauma. You're really close here to the Justice Resource Institute in Boston, which is where I've gotten some of my most life-changing training. There are so many resources out there, and so I hope to connect you to the ones that will feel helpful for you. The first one I would recommend, if you haven't read it, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Bruce Perry. This is a book, and you can see my notes. I somehow find a way that I need to read this every year. This is a book, a collection of stories. Each chapter is a clinical vignette of a child psychiatrist who worked with arguably some of the most profound examples of trauma in children. There are a lot of examples that will feel resonant to your own work, I imagine. And the stories of resiliency are just incredible. There's a lot of learning in there about the brain, but when it's done through real life examples, we can all think of somebody who matches his description. And it's the compassion with which he tells these stories, which are the stories of what trauma looks like, which is not always, you know, inspiring flowers blossoming out of cement. Sometimes it's ugly and gnarly, and we want to turn away. This is just one of the most influential, inspiring books, and something that I've actually worked with a lot of clients who have read that book as well. So my overarching goal here today is to help us find this place. So to develop this baseline understanding of trauma, how trauma works, how it impacts our brain, and then to tap into our compassion for those who experience trauma, who might be us. I mean, one of the things for me about being a trauma-informed provider is that I walk into any room, I walk into any store, I sit in any traffic jam, and I assume that most people around me have experienced trauma. That's not to say that people have experienced the same trauma, the same intensity of trauma, but what I know about what trauma forces our brains to do is that most people's brains have been forced to do that at one time or another. For me, this is where we find the trauma-informed world. Trauma-informed care cannot happen without a trauma-informed culture, and if we build enough places that have a trauma-informed culture, we just might have a trauma-informed world. And so for me, this is what guides my practice and some of my planning for today. To that end, nothing that I prepared today is in any way intended to be triggering or provocative. I'm not going to be sharing specific examples of too much trauma, but I want to recognize that I have no idea what your internal process is like. And so sometimes the very topic of talking about trauma can feel triggering. It can feel like it stirs up something inside of us. And so I want to put that out there to say that you have absolute permission and encouragement to take care of yourself in whatever way you need to. If you need to step out, feel free to step out. If you need to pass notes, I'm fine with that. If you need to take a few deep breaths, or if you just need to mentally turn off my voice, I get that. I've heard my voice recorded. I would like to turn it off currently too. So what I ask is that you do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And to respect that for our learning goals today, this won't be the format for us to share some of our own experience with trauma, but just like my clients put their, tough stuff in a mental safe space, I would encourage you to do the same. If there's anything you want to talk about afterwards, you need to process or debrief, I'm happy to do so. And if there's anything that lingers with you, I encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of it and to make that a priority. Put it on your calendar. If something, raises a flag for you today, make an appointment with yourself to take care of that. And you can use Play-Doh. So I provided you with Play-Doh. One of my biggest practitioner tips is that after Halloween and Valentine's Day, those go on sale. The trick-or-treats or the Valentine ones. So that's when I stock up. And try and buy as many as I can. I think it's still fresh. So one of the most important and simple things that we can do to help people who are trauma survivors is to help them be grounded in the present. To help them have a moment where they can check in and say, something that's going on right now reminds me of something really scary that happened before. But I can actually take a few seconds to consider, is what's happening right now dangerous, or does it just remind me of something that's dangerous? And that's what grounding tools are all about. So much of our traumatic experiences are stored in our senses. Our brain takes in information through the senses, and then it goes through a process of perception where it makes sense of it. Except that in trauma, that doesn't usually happen. So it gets sort of locked up in our senses. If we can use grounding tools that happen to at least two of our senses, we have a good chance of being able to ground ourselves in the present moment. To say, this moment reminds me of something scary, but I'm not in danger right now. Play-Doh is actually a really effective tool for that. Play-Doh has a scent, Play-Doh has a texture, it has a color. Some of you might remember that it has a taste if you took a nibble back in your younger years. I don't recommend that, and it's not gluten-free, so in case that's a concern. But to have something that connects with more than one sense can be really regulating and really grounding. I'm imagining that the people who invented the fidget spinner, who are, owning a private island somewhere right now, didn't necessarily think about trauma when they were inventing it, but it actually is a good grounding tool for trauma. It's not just a good fidget tool, it's a good grounding tool. Another really simple grounding exercise when you feel anxious is to just go through the list of senses. What can I smell right now? What can I taste right now? What do I see right now? Just put yourself in this room. I'm sure right now we all have a million things going on in our lives. At any moment, our attention is being pulled in a million different directions. But when we really need to focus on being here, connecting to our senses is a really powerful way to do that. So you'll have to Play-Doh, use it well. All right. So this is Dewey. And Dewey is my cat who is getting a bigger head by the day because he has been on a lot of PowerPoints. Dewey is where I always start when I teach about trauma. How many of you have ever spent time around a pet? Either your own, somebody else's? Fantastic. And you've all known someone who has trauma. Pets are a very traumatized population. We think, a lot of pets have really great lives. When we think about their beginning, even if they had a really smooth transition, they had a picturesque birth, they were nurtured by their mother, then likely they were ripped away from their mother to grow up in a loving home where they were purchased, $300 pet beds and things like that. But a lot of pets early on in their lives experience some sort of trauma. That trauma of detachment, of being attached and then being pulled away. Other pets, how many of you have rescued a pet? Right? The trauma histories of rescues, we can only guess at. A lot of times we guess based on what we know from the rescue, or based on what we observe, or what we imagine. But pets go through some horrible stories before they make it up. So Dewey has a complex trauma history. I won't detail all of it, because it's not probably the most important thing you'll learn today, but let's give him his, minute in the sun. We adopted Dewey from a rescue. He was rescued from what was described as a bachelor pad with 85 cats. We were told that he didn't recognize cat food, but that he really liked pizza and beer. And he was a scrappy little guy with a really talkative, he talked a lot, and six fingers, so he had a little mittens. And so we brought him home. At the time we were living in a little apartment in Boston, and we brought him home to our cat Tucker. And they were right. Dewey had no idea what cat food was. Got very excited whenever pizza or beer were around, but really didn't know what to do with cat food, didn't know what to do with treats, didn't know what to do with a ball, anything like that. Tucker stepped in, took Dewey under his wing, taught him how to be sneaky and manipulative like cats are. He taught him that if he opened his eyes really wide and looked up at us, he would probably do whatever he wanted. He taught him how to break stuff and knock stuff and scratch up the furniture and how to eat cat food. So pretty soon he was just a normal cat. A few years later, Dewey experienced a reactivating trauma. I know this sounds serious, but this is my understanding, which is that Tucker died. So Tucker was his main caregiver, and Dewey started exhibiting a lot of really severe symptoms. He would walk around all night, literally from sundown to sunup, one of Tucker's toys in his mouth, just moaning and howling and looking for Tucker. And he couldn't be soothed, and it was really difficult. Over time, my husband spent a lot of time nurturing Dewey. I'm sure by now you're all painting your own psychological profiles of me and my husband, but we had more time on our hands then. And he became sort of the stand-in. He would nurture Dewey, take care of him, and over time, a lot of the symptoms abated. For a time, Dewey wasn't eating at all, and then he would binge eat, then he wouldn't eat at all, and then he would binge eat. That sort of leveled out. We returned to some normal functionality, and we actually adopted 2 more cats, who Dewey loved. He took under his wing. He was the big brother. We were a happy family. My husband's parents they both had health crises, and so my husband went and spent about a month caring for them, and that was the trauma that really tipped Dewey over the edge. And this is the way trauma works. We'll collect these traumatic experiences that seem really big, but we'll sort of roll over them, and then something will happen that'll just sneak attack. We'll experience something that on its own doesn't seem that difficult, but what happens is it taps into all of those other traumas. And so when my husband was away, Dewey lost his little tiny mind. He started becoming really aggressive with the other cats, to the point of doing really creepy stuff that like leaned towards sociopathic tendencies. Like he would bring the other cat one of his toys, which they would never play with on their own. And he would watch them while they started playing, and then he would attack them. And he was setting up traps, and trapping our other cats. The eating behaviors all resumed, and we had a traumatized cat, probably 2 others too, but we were the star of the day. The other 2 are probably seeking out therapy for the fact that I'm only presenting about Dewey. So when we think about what happens in a trauma, our brains are doing the very best that they can to cope with trauma. And they come up with really creative, imaginative, resilient, and sometimes awful ideas for how to do that. And so Dewey was really trying to cope. I've watched those shows about the dog whisperer and the one about cats, and they focus a lot on behaviors, right? They're behavioral interventionists, which is so important. We can, especially with animals, we can identify the behavior and then we can come up with strategies to change it. A trauma-informed perspective would say it is additionally helpful if we can also understand the trauma experience at the root of it, because it can provide more information for our behavioral intervention. The happy story about Dewey is that Eric came home, spent a lot of time with Dewey. We started coming up with a schedule. So one of us would, spend time with Dewey in the morning, and over time he got better. He still howls a little bit at night, but it's like a 15-minute, we call it his announcement. It's not all night long. He eats well. And that's the really important part about trauma, is that a human brain that has no frontal lobe and is really tiny can form a new way and can heal from trauma. So can ours. I think there's someone trying to sneak in. Maybe a fetishist in the front. Awesome. Sorry, all the seats left are in the front. So if his brain has the resiliency to build new pathways to work around trauma and to make it a source of strength, of course so do ours. So when we talk about trauma, what we're talking about more than anything is the impact that it has on our brain. In a few different places, I'll present lists of common traumatic experiences, but I cannot say what is traumatic for you. I cannot say what is traumatic for someone else, because what we're looking at trauma is the resulting impact on the experience, which will be unique to every person. Psychological trauma is a unique individual experience. We can all go through the same experience today. Like, let's say some of you find this workshop to be very traumatic, legitimate. Some of you might feel like that's the case. Others of you might not have that experience, because we're bringing in our own personal lives. What happens is that the individual's ability to integrate that experience is overwhelmed. So basically, everything that our system was prepared to handle is flooded, and it can't handle what's coming at it in the moment of a trauma. The individual experiences subjectively. So this is not us, decoding the details of an event and deciding, was this really a life-threatening event? No, this is just your interpretation, your subjective experience. Was your life threatened? Was your bodily integrity threatened? Or was your sanity threatened in that moment? All of those things fit into the criteria for what constitutes trauma. So when we have any kind of situation, and it can be a single event or it can be in a collection of events, that overwhelms our ability to function or to cope, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. That overwhelming feeling might happen emotionally, it might happen cognitively, it might happen physically, it might happen on some of each of those domains. And a lot of times these experiences also involve a betrayal of trust, a loss of power or capability in the moment. And when we see these elements, that's what comes in and makes something a really complex trauma. So again, we can't say what events are considered trauma. It's pretty broad. I mean, we can think of the broad categories, but it's really more about how someone experiences something. Years ago, my three sisters and I and my sister's husband were in a car accident. And I use that term very loosely, car accident. If my older sister were here, she would say car accident. We were in the same small car, but we experienced the event completely differently. My younger sister and I were in the back seat. Both of us had been in a car accident before, a bad car accident. And we were turning left, we were waiting to make the left turn. We saw the little sister and I was turning our eye. In Ohio, back in the day, student drivers had to have a huge thing on top of their car, like billboard, student driver. And so we see this very slow-moving student driver. We're sort of like, I wonder if he's going to stop. Of course, this all happened in a matter of seconds. My sister and her husband were in the front seat, and they had no awareness of this. So at about 3.5 miles an hour, the car very slowly hit our bumper. And we were like, oh, poor kid. But my sister and her husband in the front seat were shocked. To them, it felt like 1,000,000 miles an hour, highway, hit and run scenario. Like they were panicked because they hadn't seen it coming. And so to this day, my sister and her husband will talk about the accident as being sort of this time marker. Well, that was before the accident. I'm like, what accident? Oh. The day that student driver had to wait a month to get, that accident. And I don't say that to negate my sister's experience of that, but that's just how subjective the trauma is. That people in the same small area can experience something so differently based on their previous life experiences and based on their ability to anticipate or prepare for, even in a split second, what's happening. Trauma can also include these repetitive experiences. So we look at a lot of kids, and a lot of the stories in this book were adults who, as a child, experienced patterns of neglect, experienced constant change of caregivers, constant change of homes, that constant turmoil. That can also create trauma within us. A lack of attachment early on in life is a particularly entrenched type of trauma. That's, you know, my hypothesis for what I see in some of my pets, that this lack of attachment leads to this traumatic longing for the rest of someone's life without treatment. So the definition provides us with a lot of flexibility. And so there used to be an inventory that's not used anymore, that sort of at the bottom, you know, it was like a traumatic event scale. We still use those, right? But at the bottom would be like, you added it up, and if you got a score of like, you know, 12 and above, you'd experience trauma. If you got a score of 11.9 and below, you hadn't experienced trauma. I don't know if those are the numbers. But we used to think of this in much more rigid terms, and now we're recognizing the subject. Do we have any questions or anything that seems unclear while I take a drink of water? No? All right, I'll just, yeah, great.
No, I just want to, it's interesting about what you were saying, because even within a family system, brothers and sisters may experience the family dynamic totally different. And I always have to share that with my brothers because they view things very differently than I do about my family. And it's very interesting when you look at that.
Thank you for saying that, because I actually think that that's one of the most important sort of battlegrounds for sorting out these traumatic experiences, is the recognition within a family system that people do experience things so differently, even within the same system. I think sometimes especially within the same system. And I think that's a really important point when we're working with kids and parents, or we're working with adult children and their parents who have little recognition, or they feel like they can't recognize that because it would be admitting that they had created something, that they had allowed for a trauma. And so we have to really open that up to all of those different subjective experiences.
And especially when it's not validated, if you are having a concern and the other says, no, that wasn't how it was, you know, you just feel.
And that's one of the most compounding elements of trauma. One of the studies that's really interesting about trauma is all, you know, the research that happened following September 11th. So September 11th happened, the nation was devastated, and then all the trauma researchers ran to New York City. They're like, wow, we better be there on hand to look at all this PTSD. And their assumption was that the entire city of New York would experience PTSD. Interestingly, what they found was not that. They found a lot of first responders, of course, people who were directly affected. But they found that the fact that, I mean, the hypothesis is the fact that the entire world immediately validated the trauma. That was real, that was horrible, and we love you. If those three phrases were said in the aftermath of every horrible thing that happened in people's lives, we wouldn't really be here to talk about trauma, because that validation is so important and so often missing, especially in the family system. Thank you. All right, so we can think about different categories of trauma. Single episode trauma, so the accident would be an example of that. Chronic trauma, so a lot of us would have experienced some level of chronic trauma. Single episode things that happens repeatedly, or a collection of single episode events that happen across the lifespan. That creates, not chronic in the sense that we deal with it every day, but that kind of like a sports injury, you know, it pops up every once in a while, and we have to give it some attention because we've had this chronic effect. Developmental trauma, and this is what we frequently see in a lot of the communities we're working in, is ongoing early childhood trauma, whether that's a lack of attachment, whether that's some level of neglect, abuse, constant change of caregiving situations, that can constitute developmental trauma. And then complex trauma is a lot of the work that all of these people do, which is looking at all of these different factors, these cognitive, affective, and behavioral outcomes that result from a complexity of all different kinds of trauma. This book really illustrates complex trauma very well. because what you see in this book is a lot of kids who have missed out on some of the developmental nurturing and have had some sort of disruption in their life and have had some other sort of abuse. So this complex trauma is a result of all of those kinds of things. And this is the kind of trauma that we think most when we think about a hardwired trauma. I don't even like using that term because we know now that the brain can make new wires, but this is the kind of trauma that shows up on brain scans. This is the kind of trauma that builds new pathways in the brain to cope with the trauma that are really not helpful to us in other parts of our life. And we'll look at those pictures in a second. All right, let me catch up. Attachment plays a really important role in trauma. One of the ways that attachment does that I've already mentioned, a lack of attachment early on in life especially, can create its own type of developmental trauma. A healthy attachment with any early caregiver is really important and can help provide a sense of safety and stability. When we see people who experience a series of traumas in their life who had that early healthy attachment, and people who experience similar types of chronic trauma who did not have that, the outcomes differ. The treatment differs because having that one sense of a constant safe place is really important to trauma recovery. But the other thing that attachment does is that creating attachment at any stage in life, creating a positive, healthy attachment, improves the outcome for trauma survivors at any stage. In my work, I oftentimes work with adult clients who've experienced a series of traumas in their life and have never talked about it until they were, 50, 60. One of the women in our group is 75 years old, had never talked about any of the trauma that happened. Her ability to make relationships during that trauma recovery process, her ability to form connections was instrumental to her healing, and I'm guessing her ongoing healing. And so attachment plays a really important role all across our experiences of trauma. So we know that trauma happens in the brain. We'll just do a few minutes about how it happens in the brain. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it comes from this book, Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. I really should get a cut of his sales. I cannot promote this book enough. It's a hard read, but at the same time, you won't be able to put it down. So one of the things in this book is that her brain was trying to protect her based on what it had learned of the world. And I think that is the perfect statement to capture what trauma does for our brain. So in the moment of a trauma, in the split second of a trauma, our brain comes up with a completely new strategy to help us survive. I mean, think about that. How many of you have tried to implement a new program at work, ever? Can you do it in a split second? No, but our brains can do that, which is amazing. In the moment, our brains say, we need to do this. And if we do those things, we will physically and emotionally survive this trauma. Now, caveat, I have no idea what things are going to look like on the other side of this, but this is what the brain decides we need to do to get through that trauma. And so in the moment, in the aftermath of a trauma, whether that's 2 weeks or 32 years, our brain still tries to protect us based on what it learned of the world through the trauma. The things we experience in life are mediated by the brain. So our brain takes the sensory input through our smells, through our sight, through our taste, through our touch, our hearing, and then it makes sense of it. But that effect can be moderated by trauma. So our brain can make more or less sense of things in the moment of trauma. And a lot of times what trauma does is that our brain cannot make very much sense of it. So that's why trauma memories are different. That's why when you read frustrating articles of victim statements, and they say, well, children were really reliable witness, story didn't really make sense. I don't know, what he was saying didn't really add up. That's because their brain was busy doing some other really, really important work. So the secretary function of the brain was not great. The brain is like a very simple house, but with complex visions. When we think about Dewey the cat, Dewey has a small little reptile brain, and then he has a mammal brain. And that's all Dewey's got. Dewey doesn't get the extra human part. frontal lobe. And that structure of the house is really important when we look at what happens with trauma. So here is the reptile brain. I never know why they don't make this on the picture where it's not green, because reptile, so it's just very confusing for me, but it's orange-ish. So this is the reptilian brain, and that's the part of the brain that we share with reptiles. This is survival. So eat, drink, sometimes not even eat, drink, definitely breathe, move, those kinds of things happen in the reptile brain. But the reptile brain doesn't do any complex interpretation. If you see a reptile on your way home, they're probably not thinking about relationships or like their future. They have like a really limited focal area, which sometimes would be nice, right? Like if we just have one day a week where we just have the reptile brain, it would be nice, right? And then we have this limbic system, which is the next part of the brain. Now, Julia's cat has that part of the brain, and that part of the brain can do a little bit more advanced thinking. That part of the brain has some elements of relating. They say that empathy is only here, but I think Dewey is really empathetic. But he's just an anomaly, maybe. So this part of the brain is what animals have. And then only primates and humans have this extra frontal lobe. What happens when we experience trauma is that our brain tries to be very economical and tries to save as much energy as it can for what we need. And so it shuts down the things that are not important at the moment, which unfortunately for us, when we're trying to cope with trauma later on, is most of this frontal lobe. It's where we meaning make, it's where we make sense of things, where we integrate experiences into the rest of our life, where we understand what's happening. That part of the brain does amazing things, but it requires a lot of energy. And in the moment of trauma, we don't really need to expel. And so our brain kind of shuts most of that off. We'll see a picture of this in a second. And focuses on these survival instincts, on doing what we need to survive the trauma. So when we think about it this way, it's amazing what our brains do to survive a trauma. It is amazing that we as human beings are constituted in such a way that when we get into a scary accident, or when we flee from something terrible, or when something devastating happens in our life, that our brain makes some decisions for us to help us survive that. And so that's one of the things when we work with survivors, I always think about. It's amazing that you survived, because everything that needed to happen for you to survive happened. The problem is that now you need different things to happen, and your brain still wants to go back to the default. So it's like in the moment of a trauma, our brain builds this shortcut. So I drove from Holyoke this morning. So let's say in the moment of a trauma, my brain figured out a way to get from Holyoke to Shrewsbury in 11 minutes, which would be great. That's not what happened this morning. So my brain builds this super shortcut. So in the moment of trauma, I can get from Holyoke to Shrewsbury in 11 minutes. The problem is, next week, I want to go to Lowell, right? That's where everybody is. I want to go to Lowell next week. And my brain is still sending me to Shrewsbury, because that same feeling that I had when I wanted to come to Shrewsbury, my brain was like, oh, you're going to Shrewsbury. So when I want to go to Lowell later, my brain's like, nope, you're still going to Shrewsbury. So this is what happens in trauma. Something really scary happens. Our brain creates this super shortcut, and it saves our life, or it saves our integrity. The next time something sort of scary happens, our brain's like, taking the shortcut again, even when we don't need it. That's why people who have trauma sometimes run out of a situation, because it feels scary, even though it's not. Because our brains are still sending us to Shrewsbury, even when we want to go low. Anybody have any questions about that? Yes.
Is that what causes hypervigilance and startle?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we're translating it a different way then?
Yeah, that's going to come up in the next slide. But yeah, exactly, that those responses, those fight responses are activated then on a much quicker basis, because our brain is sort of on standby. Any other questions? Okay. Here we go. There are a lot of images that you can find of brains. There's a brain researcher, Daniel Amen, who has been collecting brain scans for a really long time. And if you ever have a chance to see him present, it's amazing to see like what these look like in action. Here we have a healthy brain, and so here's our frontal lobe, so the part of the brain that Dewey doesn't have, that helps us make meaning, that helps us make sense, make connections, and integrate experiences. And the healthy brain is on fire. We're doing that all the time. Our brain is like figuring out, you know, what information do we need, what information don't we need, how do we attach that to the things that we've already learned in our lives. In an abused brain, we see something really different. We see whole parts of the frontal lobe that are not active, and that haven't sort of needed to be active because of being in this constant state of trauma, being in this constant state of survival, where this reptile part of the brain is the most active, because that's the part of the brain that's needed most. And so when we see this brain imagery, to me, it's startling. It's, you know, it's all of a sudden I can see this brought to life. The thing that's really interesting is that now we have images of brains that show people can recover, that people can reactivate part of our brain. I'm not saying we have a lot of evidence that it can be restored, especially for people who experience developmental and childhood traumas, to what it might have otherwise been, but we can build new pathways in the brain. We can turn these switches back on. And the way we do that is turning some of the other switches off. All right. Whoa. When we look at the impact of trauma and the kinds of things like hypervigilance that we're going to talk about, what we're thinking about is, you know, trauma sort of in a series. But a lot of times when we finally recognize that someone has experienced a trauma, that it has by that point are likely already been compounded. Of course, there are times when we are like a first responder, and you know we are there for the initial thing. But a lot of times, it's something that happens later in life, something that happens down the road, activates a lot of past traumas, and or someone finally crosses the path with the right person who recognizes, oh, these things that you're doing, these things that you're dealing with, that might be because of trauma. And so usually by the time we're looking at the impact of trauma, they're pretty complicated. So the outcomes of people who have experienced trauma are not great. I'm sure you're all familiar with the ACE study and how these adverse childhood experiences can collect across the lifespan and lead to all types of you know, not good outcomes. This spans across health outcomes, productivity outcomes, whether that's in the workplace, in their personal life, mental health outcomes, addiction outcomes, that trauma has a connection to all of those kinds of outcomes. This is an image drawn from the ACE study that basically showed that when we looked at these adverse childhood experiences, there was no major system of the body for which they couldn't find some sort of correlation between adverse childhood experiences, even dentistry. So, I mean, we can see the effects of trauma in all systems. This is a graphic that was put together actually with input from trauma survivors that talks about some of the more immediate impacts. So, of course, substance use is sort of the connection between chronic pain and trauma is tremendous. The connection between bodily self-destructive behaviors and trauma is also very significant. A lot of times what people talk about, and the one that's book that I don't have here, the Bessel-Van-Der-Kolk Body Keeps the Score, is that trauma is stored in our brain and it's mirrored in our body. And so our bodies tell a story of our trauma through all of these different outcomes. And that's the case that we see those impacts really acutely. Yes?
Can you just restate that book you just mentioned?
The Body Keeps the Score, and it should be on the last slide. It's Bessel-Van-Der-Kolk. It's a great book. It's on sale on Amazon right now, actually.
I bought 2 copies of it.
It's a great book. Have you gotten through much of it?
Yeah.
And have you found it to be pretty, I think it's pretty readable.
Yeah, it's very readable.
Yeah.
I actually sent one to my daughter, but I also, while I sat here, ordered that book and sent one to my daughter in California.
Yeah, those are two of my favorite ones. And when I teach the class, those are always students' favorites because they're easy to read, they're easy to understand, and they read just so quickly. All right, so here's some of the language that you, Connie, were talking about that's really important in our understanding of trauma, which is these trauma responses that can become very ingrained and very automatic. So hypervigilance, hyperarousal, hypoarousal, dissociation, and avoidance are basically the most common cluster of trauma systems. And this is what we can use to help us make sense of the presentation of trauma survivors. Hypervigilance is what we need to survive a trauma. So hypervigilance is an enhanced state of sensory awareness. It's when we're on guard. It's when you're a kid and you're playing, hide and go seek, and you see somebody move. You're hyper aware that that person moves, and you're going to find them. It's that feeling of being on guard for what's going to happen. A lot of times when a trauma happens, it catches us by surprise. And I think that whether we do this, I'm assuming it's mostly unconsciously, but we have this feeling like, if only I'd been more aware. If only for my sister and the accident, if only I'd known what my sisters knew in the backseat, I could have prepared. And so the brain puts itself on high alert. And one of the ways this can look is by being hypervigilant. Not everybody will experience this because some people's brains in the aftermath decide to sort of do the opposite and numb themselves. But hypervigilance is a really common reaction. And how this looks is when we see people in a group setting and maybe somebody sneezes up here and in the back, somebody falls back out of their chair. And now I just gave everybody a panic attack, sorry. Very. Can't wait to never listen to this recording, by the way. It's when somebody has that huge startle reaction because they're on alert, they're bracing themselves for what might be coming. This can also be paired with an increased state of anxiety, which can lead to constant exhaustion, to being always constantly on guard, leads to a sense of fatigue. Hyperarousal is a related concept, being ready to be aroused. So having all of our systems just ready to go. What's also common in trauma survivors is the opposite, so hypoarousal, where we're not ready. This is actually what we saw a lot in the faith group. For a lot of the members of that group, they didn't feel any certain sense of fear or hypervigilance. They actually a lot of times ended up continuing to be surprised by being re-assaulted or re-victimized, in part because of their developmental disabilities, but also because that's what a sense of powerlessness can lead to. It doesn't really matter what I do, right? It's gonna happen, it's gonna happen. And so sometimes our reaction looks like that. So here we have the spectrum of hypo, so sort of under, around, hyper, and of course we want to find a balance in the middle where we're ready, where our body can respond if we need to. That's the flight or flight. That's the moment where we decide, can I run to get out of this emergency or am I going to freeze? And we don't make conscious choices about that. But in trauma therapy and in trauma and supportive services, we can start breaking that down a little bit. We can do things like grounding ourselves in the present moment so that when things happen, we are prepared, but we're not living constantly on guard. Association describes a whole myriad of behaviors. A lot of dissociative responses to trauma happen in the moment, which is why sometimes people have no clear memories of the trauma, and also afterwards. In groups, we see this a lot. This is something that as a group facilitator, I'm always looking for, is when people leave their bodies. when people get sort of a blank look on their face and they've gone someplace else. That dissociation is a very, very protective function. Dissociation helps us get through a lot of tough things. We all dissociate. Some of you might be dissociating right now. When we need our brains to do other things, we need our brains to not be in the room, either because it's scary, or because we're bored, or because we're really anxious about something coming up in 10 minutes. So dissociation serves a very protective function. But what happens is, like so many of these other responses, when it becomes our default, when it becomes automatic, it becomes problematic and it becomes dangerous. People who experience hypoarousal, sort of this numbing reaction, dissociate frequently, and a lot of times aren't then present when they need to make a decision about something, which can perpetuate this cycle of being vulnerable and not having resiliency factors. All right, one of the other things that's important is that when we look at trauma outcomes and trauma survivors, one of the things that trauma survivors often talk about is the betrayal of trust being sort of eclipsing every other kind of trauma. And this can be difficult for caregivers to understand that this horrible thing happened, but what they're maddest about is that I was, 10 minutes late that day. It's because of that attachment thing, that sometimes we have this sense of betrayal somewhere in the realm of the trauma, that becomes the thing that we fixate on. Does anybody ever listen to the moth, the stories that people tell? So the moth is like a podcast type thing where people speak publicly, and tell their stories. That's just me. I feel right now. And they tell like 5-minute stories in a public venue, and those are recorded and they're played over the podcast. And they're amazing stories because people will take these small moments of their life and summon all their bravery and courage to come up and tell this story. And there's this one collection of those stories that's about September 11th. And the thing that's really interesting about those stories, and it relates to the betrayal trauma, so these stories are about people who experienced September 11th, and none of them are talking about what actually happened. They're talking about the fact that they left their house, they didn't kiss their kids goodbye in the morning. They're talking about the fact that they got in a fight with their roommate the day before, and it was unresolved, and they spent all day wondering if they'd ever get to resolve that argument. And so this relational part of trauma oftentimes becomes bigger than even the traumatic event. And that's something to really pay attention to. Because a lot of times people will hear that and say, well, you're deflecting from like talk about the real trauma. This is just sort of a side thing. And really a lot of times that's what people feel most connected to. All right. So complex trauma, as I said at the beginning, is sort of the hardwired trauma. And these are the kinds of traumatic experiences that are repetitive, prolonged, involve more direct harm, direct neglect. Abandonment is a great example of a complex trauma. A complex trauma is the person who has come to sort of expect trauma as like the baseline of their life, who might not, probably wouldn't even recognize it as trauma. A lot of times, traumas that are defined as complex occur at developmentally critical moments. And there are a lot of developmentally critical moments across the lifespan. But one of the things that's really interesting about this trauma research, the research that they've done with rats, that when they give small amounts of distress to a rat that's at a developmental milestone. I don't know what the developmental milestones are for rats, but like when they're growing a lot. If they give a small amount of distress to a rat then, the impacts on the bodily system of that rat are tremendous. Versus if they gave the same small amount of distress to a rat in late 30s, whatever that is for rats, like a less developmentally critical stage, that the impact of that distress is less. So when we think about people that we're working with who have experienced childhood traumas, every year of childhood is a developmentally critical stage. Every single day is a developmentally critical stage. And so when we look at developmental trauma, childhood trauma, we're looking at complex trauma. Complex trauma affects every system, and we'll talk about some of these in more detail later, but cognition, emotions, sensations, body relationships, problems with dissociation, emotional regulation, somatic distress, so people who have a lot of physical complaints that may have just a physical source, but are often connected with psychological sources of pain. Relational alienation, so either not being able to form relationships and pulling away at even the first sign of a relationship, sometimes the opposite, relational enmeshment. Cognitive distortion, so minimizing the trauma, that's a really adaptive strategy. Dissociating, self-loathing, self-criticism, the impact on self-concept and self-esteem cannot be overstated. Anger, rage, trauma bonding, so feeling like the most important relationship in life is to the trauma, or to the people that sometimes even cause the trauma. You know, when people feel like the most important thing about them is this trauma they experience, that trauma-formed identity, that's really significant and really common because it's our way of sort of honoring the thing that happened. And then relational reenactment, so acting out the abandonment, the neglect, I view the abuse either as in the role of victim or in the role of perpetrator.
Is minimization and intellectualizing the same thing?
So I think that it sort of depends on the presentation of it. I think they're very related. So minimization tends to look like that didn't really happen or that wasn't a big deal. And I think that blurs into intellectualization when we start saying, well, you know, if I break it down like this, it actually kind of makes sense that this happened. So I think that they are related in what their function is. They might just look a little different. There's a great article. I'll have to see if I can find it. If I do, I don't know, you know, about this this minimization, specifically with kids, and you know, the self-talk that sometimes accompanies it, of like, you know, I'm strong, this is not a big deal. That there's like this active process of sort of talking oneself out of it being a big deal, and that can be sort of rewarded in a social context. But I think that they're definitely related. All right. So other impacts of trauma, I mean, we see this across all populations: stress reactivity, mood instability, attention issues, irritability, oppositionality, withdrawal or enmeshment, behavioral concerns, depression, anxiety, phobia, dissociation, impulse control, eating disorders, sexual disorders, sleep disorders. So across the mental health spectrum, we see connections to trauma. So this is the last slide, and then we'll take a little break. So what's important to understand when we think about trauma, especially as we start shifting towards thinking about a trauma-informed approach to care, is that the brain systems respond to stress and threat across all five senses. As I said, our brain turns on our senses to detect threat. That's part of the reason why sometimes when people survive a trauma, they have these very strong sense memories, even if they don't have a lot of concrete memories. So this was something that's really common when I work with survivors of sexual assault, when I work with survivors of human trafficking. A lot of times there are fragrances, there are sounds that are very triggering. And so when we come together as a group, as much as we can, we try and identify those things on the front end to provide a safe space, but then to help people live in the reality that those senses can cross their path at any time. That those sense memories put them in a situation where they have to decide, I feel scared because this sense is scary to me. Am I in danger, or is this a memory of a time I was in danger and now I'm actually safe? So this is another quote from the book that I just love. Memory is the capacity to carry forward in time some element of an experience. Memory is what the brain does, how it composes us, and allows our past to determine our future. So our brain catalogs these trauma memories, and it's helpful to us. If we didn't have a memory of what sirens meant, when we were driving on the road and sirens came up behind us, we might, you know, just ignore them. If we didn't have a memory of what smoke meant, we could be in a lot of trouble. So these sense memories are really important, and the associations that our brains form are critical to our survival, but they become problematic when they're on high alert. So the brain is a muscle. We can exercise different parts of our brain. If we're exercising one part, it's going to get stronger. And if we're ignoring one part, it's going to get weaker. We saw that on the image of the brain. Part of the brain that was so strong in that child that had experienced abuse was the survival part of the brain. That was, you know, professional wrestler strong. But the other parts of the brain that hadn't been utilized were not developed. So this is trauma. This is what trauma does to our brain. Trauma is our brain's best effort to survive. Our brain's most creative strategies to survive that end up later on causing us problems. The reason I tell the story of Dewey when I start talking about trauma is because Dewey's adorable. Everybody loves Dewey, even dog people love Dewey because Dewey can actually play fetch. So he's remarkable on every level. And when Dewey does bizarre things, we think, well, you're adorable and wonderful, and even though you just baited the other cats into an entrapment situation where you attack them, I know that you're a good, loving cat and you're adorable. We don't respond the same way to people who are traumatized. People who experience trauma do exactly the same kinds of things. They try and control their environment through aggression, through sorrow, through depression, through compulsive behaviors, and it doesn't always look so adorable. And so that's the trauma-informed part, is being able to look at something that doesn't look pretty, and to know that there's something meaningful behind it. All right, so does anyone have any questions before we take a little break, stretch our legs, and use our Play-Doh? Okay, so why don't we take about a 10-minute break and come back and see what happens. And I'm going to turn off this microphone.
I know, right? Let's go in.
Oh, it's horrible. I asked him to work out it. Turn the other way. It's long. Come on to the bathroom. Just stand there down the hallway. And I have it from yeah, absolutely. I have problems with everything. I also. Okay. Oh, thank you. Coffee table. Oh, yeah. That's cool where she works. I forgot. Yeah, I remember when I had my first look at it, but all that later on I had. Oh, yeah. Oh, that was me the other day. Yeah.
Where you're not, you know, like,
It really is.
always
Oh, okay. I think so. I'm pretty sure she's doing a 4-hour training thing. And then going. But yeah.
Is it really okay to really want that? Oh, right. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
What?
Oh, it knows.
Right. Oh, it is really cold.
All right. Yeah, you gotta like, talk forever. Yeah, all right, yeah, please. I know you're running your brain. All right.
Yeah. My other brother, yeah. Are you there?
He's throwing it around my leg. Yeah, it's gonna be hot right there.
Joanne emailed me that.
Then I saw that in the training. I went in and just be, gotta call these like.
No, I knew the training was given.
Yeah. So then I look back at my email.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Direct it over. I went there on Monday, and I, right now, so I did, and I told them that I found your training very like these all the language. No, I didn't think yes, they do. But yes. Oh, right. I don't think they can cut out my part. Okay, but she's sharp. And never recorded it that way. You know what I mean? Like I'm so guilty and I didn't do it. Yeah, it does. It's only her, she could tell her. I read the boy.
There you go. All right. Oh, boy. The microphone is back. Okay. So we're going to move into talking a little bit more specifically. Thank you for all your questions. I'm happy to answer any and all questions that I can and direct you to other resources. Again, everything I've learned has come from workshops and reading, and there's so many good resources out there. And I really welcome the opportunity to continue to share resources. People also learn from you. It's been great just hearing little snippets about what you're doing out there. So I'm very appreciative to be here with all of you. We're going to move into talking a little bit more specifically about trauma as it relates to individuals with developmental disabilities. But I want to say just a few hopefully uplifting words about trauma, healing, and recovery. So earlier I made the sort of sports injury analogy, and I think that that's really what this trauma-informed perspective looks at. Traumas are not things that we get over, nor are they things that we necessarily need to or sometimes want to. I mean, how many of you have ever had something bad happen and somebody seems to want you to get over it really quickly? That feels bad. And a lot of times the things that happen in trauma are important to our lives. And so the idea that we can get over something is a falsehood. But we can heal. Our brains can form new pathways and strategies of being, which doesn't mean that the trauma is removed. It means that our resiliency factors are enhanced, and that we have new tools for coping and new strategies for working with whatever the trauma is. So we know that people can heal and heal, not be cured, because that's never really the goal. Instead of moving directly from a trigger to a trauma response, we can gradually build in the opportunity for that moment of, this reminds me of something scary, am I in danger? And that's what we really want to go towards, because the reality is that people who are traumatized have a very hard time living in the present moment. They're called to the past by the scary, traumatic things that happen, and they're worried about the future because something scary and traumatic may likely happen again. And so if we can start growing what the present moment feels like for trauma survivors, that's the healing work. So there's a lot of encouraging brain research showing that we can, build these new pathways, strengthen these parts of the brain. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that people are doing that in different types of treatment. So, all right. So I put this information up here, but I have to imagine this is not news to anybody in the room. But there's so much data in terms of the commonality of traumatic experiences among persons with developmental disabilities. 4 times as likely to be the victims of crime. That number is probably low because we also know that the rates of reporting are much lower amongst persons with developmental disabilities. 64% in this study, which is old, but I can't imagine these rates have changed dramatically, of children who are abused had a disability. 5 million crimes are committed each year against persons with disabilities. The commonality of sexual abuse, the very high incidence of these traumas of abuse happening with people who are trusted, people who are in the family, people who are care providers. All of those things are prevalent in the community in which you're working. Because of this, the rates of trauma are just significant. And for a lot of reasons, a few of which I'll try to make a guess at, there hasn't been a strong awareness of this. Even though we know it, like we know the stats, but just as an example, I really keep up on the books that are published in trauma, and there's like 2 titles that relate to trauma specifically for persons with developmental disabilities. That's not a lot of books, considering the numbers that we're looking at. A lot of times when symptoms of trauma are seen in a person with a developmental disability, those symptoms are just sort of lumped in with the developmental disability. They're sort of eclipsed by that diagnosis because there can be some overlap. But what we know, and we know that, again, not me, like I haven't done this, but somebody knows, and I've learned from them, that the impacts on the brain are similar. And so these traumas are happening. People with disabilities are coping with them in very adaptive, creative, amazing ways, and are exhibiting traumatic symptoms that might look like part of their developmental disability, but need to be recognized as being separate, or not separate, but distinct. All right. So what we know is abuse and neglect have profound impact on brain development. That's an established fact. The more prolonged the abuse or neglect, the more arduous the recovery process would be, the more likely that the brain damage would be significant or permanent. So not only are people with developmental disabilities more likely to be exposed to trauma, but exposure to trauma can exacerbate some of the functional limitations, some of the impacts of the developmental disability. So this is just this awful sentence. People with developmental disabilities are more likely to be exposed to trauma, and exposure to trauma makes their developmental disability more severe. I mean, and this is really a such a sad truth that has just existed for a long time. And it's why I think it's so great that so many agencies and so many states are taking this look at trauma as being something that's not simply part of the intake assessment, but a special filter through which we can look at what we need to do with these individuals. So again, I'm not going to read through these because this is stuff that you know, but so many things about developmental disabilities leave individuals who have those diagnoses more vulnerable. The cognitive limitations, the reliance on caregivers, the want to be compliant with authority, the emphasis on behavioral interventions and modifications. All of these things can lead to more vulnerability, and that's what we really found when we were doing the case group. And people in the group started sharing, and we had a very wide range in that group in terms of abilities. We had people who were very verbal, we had people who were nonverbal who came with an age. But once we started talking about trauma and experiences people have had, we heard a lot of stories where people in the group tried to communicate something that was going wrong, but didn't have success in doing so for a number of reasons that show up here. Some of the myths that have perpetuated our lack of attention to trauma are actually really similar to some of the myths surrounding kids and why kids actually didn't get a lot of attention for trauma for a long time. So something that we talk about often when it comes to kids is the resiliency of kids. And that is true. The brain is still forming, the brain is still developing. Kids have a lot of ability to bounce back from things. And I think for a long time people saw that resiliency factor as being a reason to not pay attention to whatever they might need to be resilient from. And really when you think of those things as an and, not just an or, children are resilient and children need supportive services to manage and to overcome and to thrive from trauma. And the same is true in the community of persons with developmental disabilities. So there was a myth, and I think it still persists, that people with developmental disabilities do not experience trauma in the same way. That because their cognitive processing might be different or might look different, because their developmental age might be different or look different, that the impact of trauma is somehow less than. And that's a really nice myth because it makes it think like, oh, okay, so there are just these special people out there who are impervious to the impact of trauma. We don't really need to work on that. Of course, that's not true, and that's why you're all doing the work that you're doing. That's why positive behavioral supports are a huge step away and up from aversive strategies. That's why we're looking at people more holistically. The other belief is that people with developmental disabilities cannot benefit from therapy, including trauma-based treatment. This one is mind-blowing to me, and this has persisted for a long time. And I'll tell you, when I started working at the Rape Crisis Center, where we were free, but we had to collect a significant amount of data on the clients that we saw. In the 5 years before I had been there, we hardly had any clients who reported as having developmental disabilities or who were referred from DDS. Sorry, I'm still learning Massachusetts acronyms. Still speaking Ohio. So this is what it looks like. Like, oh, okay, so I guess that nobody with developmental disabilities has ever had, sexual abuse, sexual assault. That's what it looks like from our report. But of course, that's not the truth. The truth is that the people who were working, the providers who were working with those people didn't see the Rape Crisis Center as a helpful resource because we hadn't made any kind of outreach to that community, and we hadn't said, these services are for you, too. These services are helpful. We are here to work with you. Those lines of communication were never open. And I think that that's true in a lot of places that do specialized work for trauma. I think that a lot of doors haven't been open. And I think that these myths are very convenient to allowing that to persist. But of course we know that's not true, especially when we think about this. When we look at all of the different types of treatments that are available for people who experience trauma, and the treatments that people find to be most helpful, these are the exact kind of treatment that the two previously ignored populations, children and individuals with developmental disabilities, can tremendously benefit from. Not talk therapy, art therapy, music therapy, movement, psychodrama, drumming, doing things that engage our senses and allow people to express in different ways. Of course, there's a place for talk therapy, and a lot of people benefit tremendously. But if you read these books, I mean, there's a story in here of this, you know, huge psychiatrist who knows everything about the brain, rolling around on the floor playing with a kid for 7 months before anything happened. Those are the kind of strategies that help people heal from trauma. And so how could that not be helpful to these populations? So those myths have persisted for a long time. The fact, people with developmental disabilities suffer and struggle from the impact of trauma in remarkably similar ways. People with developmental disabilities have the same challenge of trying to fit in this experience that is either spoken or unspoken, of which they are aware or unaware, into a life that doesn't make it easy to make sense out of. All of those things are compounded by the circumstances of life, whatever that might be. The stress of having some sort of meaningful daily activities or meaningful work. The stress of dealing with family who doesn't support you. The stress of feeling alone. The stress of dealing with the separation from a caregiver that you've worked with. I mean, talk about something that can be reactivating for a trauma survivor. So the facts negate the myth. Treatment and attention is important and it is meaningful. One of the things we have to think about, and so, you know, if there's, you know, anything that you take from today, is just cautioning the people that you work with, the families that you work with, to not attribute normative responses to trauma. So when I say normative responses to trauma, I mean all the things that might look icky or weird or uncomfortable, to not just lump that in with the developmental disability. To not just think that it's ADD or some sort of attention-related concern. So be able to look beyond that. Because the trauma-informed lens is also a magnifying glass. It's like a magnifying glass and a telescope, and it allows us to bring different things into focus. And if we have an awareness that most of the people we're working with experience trauma, it's worth it to pull out that lens. Similar types of symptoms occur. But again, a lot of times they're not recognized. There's a lot of reasons. One, and I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with this in your work, is the turnover of caregivers. The unreliability of primary support people, either in the family system, in the community, that makes it so hard for people to notice when something's different. If I met all of you today, I have no idea. You could all be completely different people than you were yesterday. But I didn't know you yesterday, so I have no idea. And that's why we have to find a way to create a meaningful record, a meaningful way of communicating from one person to the next. What is the baseline? And I know that's complicated because we have to fill out all these forms and there's all these, you know, language we have to use. And how do I know if the way I'm saying something is similar to what, you know, the other person's saying? But it's a really important part of what we do, to be able to have that baseline that continues person to person. The other thing we have to think about is that we have to think really creatively about the ways in which past abuse can be triggered by things that seem very unrelated. Some obvious, but some of them less so. So we have all these past abuses, past traumas. I mean, obviously, restraint, those kinds of things are very triggering. So can be teasing, humor. We think about the different ways that people manipulate and coerce when it comes to an abusive situation, how people are demeaned and bullied. So, you know, paying attention to joking words, sarcasm, the feelings of rejection, that's a really high one for anybody who's experienced trauma, and specifically for people with developmental disabilities. That was a huge topic in the first group that we ran, was like, how do we make sure we all stay friends? Because it really sucks when I have a friend and then I don't have a friend. And attendance became a hot button issue because people wanted to see familiar faces, and it was really hard when that didn't happen. Lack of attention is very reminiscent of neglect. Even when it's just something as simple as, hang on one second, I just need to fill out this form, and then before you know it, like the behaviors have just mushroomed off it. From a trauma-informed lens, we can see that behavior as evidence of pain, of psychological pain. Loss, staff turnover, I mean, these things are unavoidable. And it's not that, I mean, it would be great if we could somehow make sure they never happen, but that's not life. And so preparing ourselves to view these through a trauma-informed lens and to coach people through the process from that perspective is important. Bedtime is a really big one. So many times when the day gets darker, that's when abuse occurs. That's when people feel the acuteness of abandonment the most. There's a great article that's like a case study of one person who has lived in a lot of different residential settings and talked about in the therapist in the article, the unfamiliarity of the bed and how that was just like a real reminder and a trigger of like, once again, starting over. And so bedtime, even years later, when that person was living in the same space for 20 years, every night was a trigger. Loud noises and yelling, those ones seem obvious, but whispering and close talking can also be incredibly triggering from a trauma perspective, for sure. So for, I mean, you're all familiar with this, with the implementation of positive behavioral support, looking at communities and individuals more holistically, and including behavioral interventions as part of the strategy, but not rooting our strategies only in behaviors. That's really what this trauma-informed perspective argues for. If we start at the behavioral level, and that's where we focus, we miss everything that's underneath the behavior. If we start from a foundation of understanding trauma, behaviors suddenly look different to us. The strategies we implement might end up being very similar, but our understanding of what those behaviors represent and what those behaviors might be communicating and what opportunities for intervention might exist in those behaviors changes if we start from this trauma-informed perspective. Now, if you go online and you look up trauma-informed care, you'll find 1,000,005 different acronyms. There's like, TICP, TIP, TTIC, TTCV. I mean, you'll find a lot of letters. And I'm not advocating for any particular letters today. But what I'm saying is that if we use the trauma-informed understanding as sort of like an overhead, a transparency that we put on top of whatever model of care we're using now, we can use that to enhance the work that we're doing. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. Isn't that a cute picture? All right, so here's some of the letters. So when we talk about trauma-informed treatment, we're talking about treatment that is guided through our understanding of trauma, that is guided through our understanding neurologically, biologically, psychologically, physiologically, and also socially of the effects of trauma. And that deep understanding of, the tentacles of trauma that wrap themselves around all different parts of people's lives is primary in our understanding of the person in front of us. So from a trauma-informed perspective, we think about the kinds of intake forms we use. And, we collect history on people's traumatic experiences. It's not just one part of the intake, it's the foundation for the work that we do. And for myself, I operate on that assumption, even if people don't report that they have a trauma. Not that I'm thinking like, I know your life better than you, I know that you have a trauma history. But because I'm making an assumption that the person in front of me, in one way or another, has had their life impacted by trauma. And that's just my view of the world. If I operate from that perspective, my interactions with that person change. The joke that I always make, so if you go to another training with me ever, don't be surprised if I say this one again. Of course, it doesn't mean that, like, my every interaction I'm able to be trauma-informed. You know, if I'm driving and somebody cuts me off, my first thought is not, they've been through a lot. They've been abandoned by their mother, they survived a house fire. My reactions are much shorter, and less compassionate. But when I think about people and human interactions through the lens of trauma, all of a sudden things make sense to me. Things feel less, they feel more and less personal, because there's this universality, this idea that we've all been doing the best we can, and that looks different for different people. So this approach doesn't only acknowledge trauma as a factor, but it centers trauma. That is more important necessarily than anything else that's going on in this person's ecology, but it's really central to understanding them. And so if we center that, and then we look at these different domains, behavioral domains, those behaviors look different because they serve likely a very, very important and adaptive function. So, I don't know, I made some pictures that I'm not sure actually make sense when I put them up in front of people, but if we think about these different paradigms in the work that we do with individuals, families, and communities, that we're looking to build safety and inclusivity, we're also looking to build safety and autonomy, and safety and accessibility, you know, so safety being really the cushion for all of this. That if we center this in an understanding of trauma, that informs how we go about doing each of these things. And then if we think about the role that attachment plays in healing from trauma, we build these layers of connection between each of these things. And so there's this cycle of centering trauma, building these connections, and then attending to these domains through a trauma perspective. I'm going to talk about that a little more explicitly. So here's another image. We start with this foundational understanding of trauma, and we really build safety. And safety in all ways. So safety to be in the room, safety to be in a relationship, resources and supports that keep a person feeling physically safe. Education that helps them understand their body and the way that people can and have hurt them. This understanding of trauma and safety, that roots our work. And then we move up. We build accessibility, inclusivity. We help people get involved in communities in a safe way that recognizes their experience of trauma. And we help them build towards autonomy in a safe way that recognizes their experience of trauma. And so if we're always building upon that foundation, it gives a little more information in terms of how we can guide our intervention. All right, I'm going to pass out. So the truth is that we, no surprise, do not live in a trauma-informed world. So the way I think about that is that this is an image. If you do a Google image search for trauma recovery, I bet $10 you'll come up with something like this. You know, it's a dark, cracked parking lot, and a beautiful plant is emerging. And that's a wonderful thought that that from trauma can come new growth. But the reality is we live in a world where a lot of people aren't paying any attention to new growth and might just accidentally step right over your new flower. I'm being generous and thinking that most people don't do that intentionally. But when I go to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get my new driver's license, and I forgot one of my documents, the person behind the desk doesn't really care if I've experienced personal trauma that day. So they're not working from a trauma-informed perspective necessarily. And so they're short, and they might not be polite, and it might make me feel bad. So I'm like, don't we understand what just happened in my life? No, of course not. And then there are other people who, are just jerks. I think that's a lesser number. So the fact that we don't live in a trauma-informed society means that we have to start, we have to be sort of disciples of this work. If this gets weird, if my language sounds cultish, I don't mean that. But this work starts with us, with the perspective that we bring to our families, to our clients, to the communities, and to our workplace. A trauma-informed workplace is different. Working in a place that recognizes the experience of trauma and the impact of vicarious trauma is different than working in a place that doesn't do those things. And I've had experiences of each. So being trauma-informed means believing, and not just believing, but really knowing that at any given moment, every person is doing the best that they can to survive. Every trauma survivor is doing their absolute best to survive. And recognizing that trauma survivors are in a constant battle against a story in their brain that tells them that at any given moment they're in danger, that at any given moment somebody that they love is going to be taken away from them, and that at any given moment something very core to who they are as a person can be altered. And that's a life or death struggle. And so the way people cope doesn't always look nice, and being trauma-informed means that we know that. So what happens when we use a trauma-informed approach? Obviously, the techniques that use aversive, restrictive practices are recognized as being re-traumatizing and triggering. What I want to say as a caveat to all of this is that we cannot create a world where trauma survivors are never going to be triggered. We can't do that. I think even if we created our dream world, you know, something would go wrong. It's impossible to predict. And so that's not the goal. The goal is to compassionately design our services and our interventions in ways that we prepare people for what to expect, we keep our word, and we recognize when a triggerhead moment has happened, and we take time to take care of that. So people are always informed of when it happens before it happens. Wouldn't that be great if we could live our life that way? If we could say, in 5 minutes, I'm going to do this, and then in 5 minutes it actually happens. We can't do that because we can't control everything, but we can do our very, 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 very best all the time. Like when you go to the doctor and they say you're going to feel a prick, and then you feel like, you know, a sword. That intervention came from years and years and years of researchers watching tapes with doctor-patient interactions and seeing, this is something I just happened to learn from somebody who's in the medical world, seeing the quality of the relationship decline after a medical intervention for which the patient was not prepared. So then they thought, well, let's try this experiment where we tell people you're going to feel a little pinch or a little prick, and even though it's a lie, people will be prepared for that. And what they saw is that there was a less dramatic dip in the quality of the relationship. So just in these little ways of informing people, this is what's going to happen. We can help people prepare themselves. Trauma responses are seen as resilient adaptations instead of problematic behaviors. That might just sound like semantics, like a nice positive spin, but it's important for us to start training our thinking that way. That what's happening has a function, and that if we are looking through a trauma-informed perspective, the function of that is to do something protective or to do something that your brain trained itself to do for scarier situations, and that there's something about this situation right now that's feeling a little reminiscent. Real empathy is demonstrated. So on the slides before this, there's a link that I'm not sure we'll have time to watch. Has anybody watched the little video by Brene Brown about empathy? So that's like required viewing. It'll take 5 minutes out of your day. It'll make your day so much better. Because that, and if we have time at the end, I'll show it. That video talks about empathy as being in the ugliness, not saying, hey, it's gonna get better. You look great, I love your shirt. Everything's fine. Well, at least things aren't worse, but getting down in there and saying, whoa, this is really scary, and you're really terrified right now, and I'm here with you in that moment. And that's what real empathy looks like. So again, trauma responses are rooted in deep pain. This doesn't always look good. It's also important in a trauma-informed approach that when we're offering a choice, it's a real choice. It's not like when we, you know, I remember this time I won a carnival game, and then my mom was like, oh, 2 prizes you can choose from. Oh, those fish look, I don't know if we want to get goldfish, but those baseball caps are really amazing and really sparkly. They won't require any care or attention. I think you should show students the baseball cap. Well, that wasn't a real choice because I chose the fish and I was not allowed to have the fish. Because the cap was. So we have to make sure that we're not offering a fish or a baseball cap if the only choice is a baseball cap. So if we offer a choice, it has to be a real choice that we will honor and stand behind, even if the choice selected is the goldfish. We have to recognize that limit setting and rule enforcing can be triggering. Again, this doesn't mean that we're going to be able to avoid this, but that we have to recognize that from a trauma-informed perspective, that can feel very re-traumatizing. There's a gentleman that came to speak at Holyoke, who was a graduate, what's his name, who wrote the book? Don Vittis, who was a graduate of Holyoke Community College, and he had been in Belchertown, and he had survived a lot of different institutional settings as a person with developmental disabilities. And he came and spoke about his book and his life. And he was like, any of you in this room, social workers, counselors, psychologists? By the end, half the room was raising their hands. Like, I hate you all. I hate you all because all you represented to me. He's like, well, I don't hate you now, but I hated you for most of my life. All you represented to me was people trying to imprison me, people trying to confine me. And when I talked to him afterwards, he said, oh, it's nice to meet you. I don't really hate you. He's like, I've never met you, okay? I don't really hate you yet. And I said, well, what has made that different? And he said, well, what got different as I got older is people started telling me the reasons why things had to happen. People started, asking me how I felt about things. Like, that doesn't mean that there are rules I have to follow. And so I think it's really important that we think about it in that way from a trauma-informed perspective. Yeah.
Let me just plug, the book is called You're Gonna Like It Here.
It's such a good book.
Yeah.
It's a really, really good book.
Where was here?
Oh,
Yeah.
He's a man who, to this day, and he's my age anyhow, sees himself as being retarded. That's his language, not mine. And he's not. And he's done a tremendous amount of work, deep reflection and insight. Right? I'm just pitching the book.
Totally.
It's phenomenal.
I mean, I'm not from Holyoke, and so when I arrived Holyoke, and my boss told me about this book, I picked it up and read it, not knowing any of the history of the institutional movement in Massachusetts, and certainly not Belgium. It's an amazing book, and it is a really great, in terms of trauma, looking at the different moments that were empowering for him, and it's a very honest portrayal. It's not a rosy glow story. But yeah, he's great, and I'm really proud of it. So everybody should buy a copy. You can buy it on Amazon, and at a few independent booksellers. I think if you go to the website, you'll find that. All right, so I wanted to take just a little bit of a look at how trauma-informed care matches up with some of what we do and what we've done in the past. So, I mean, this is obviously a very pared-down history. But if we start looking at non-aversive behavioral supports, and when those started becoming more and more prevalent, the core idea behind non-aversive behavioral supports was this idea of do no harm, and that was sort of the core value that underlying those strategies. And it's really not, so important to go through the history of that, except to say that set the stage for positive behavioral support and person-centered planning, which takes that a step further. So it takes non-aversive techniques and the do no harm, and it elevates that to do good. So we're not just going to do no harm, but we're going to try and do good. And the values that are woven through those strategies is having choices, having true collaboration, being able to practice self-control, self-determination, and social inclusion, and also being able to utilize varied forms of communication. That can mean different communication modalities, but it can also mean different communication systems. So working with a family, working with a primary caregiver, working with the community. And so if we think about these strategies, I'm guessing these are what you guys are mostly using. Yeah. Okay. We think about these strategies and we look at these core values, it's a perfect match for trauma-informed care, really. trauma-informed care is just an enhancement of this, by using that trauma as the center point. So if you look at this worksheet that I handed out, I have to apologize because it was supposed to be a cute little like bifold, and you can see it's like upside down and inside out, and it's crooked. I tried to do the right thing by sending it like copy services instead of making the copies. Anyway, sorry. So we're going to start on the side that says providing trauma-informed care. So this is kind of a distillation of a lot of different approaches to trauma-informed care. So a lot of different acronyms. These are the common threads. So including trauma assessment as an ongoing part of services. This is really important because we're not really just talking about formalized assessment, which you certainly can use. There's a number of trauma assessments that have been researched a lot that were designed for use with children and adolescents that have been shown to have accessibility in working with persons with developmental disabilities. That said, you have to make decisions about how that fits into your approach to care. For some people, even getting through a trauma assessment can be very triggering and very evocative. Some people aren't necessarily aware of the trauma or able to verbalize it, able to communicate about it. And so that's not really what I mean when I say assessment. I mean monitoring for symptoms of trauma and paying attention to all of them, cataloging them. In the agency that I worked with most recently, we had a form in our electronic medical records that was specifically for trauma symptoms that would pop up. So it was more like a log. So instead of having to read through all the treatment notes, we would have this separate log. And if you put something in your treatment note about noticing X, Y, and Z, those trauma symptoms, the Q&A people would say, why isn't this in your log? So that way, when people came into the home, when different kinds of service providers who might not need the whole clinical file were going in, they could just read this little list and be updated. That's working under the hypothesis that when we see trauma symptoms, there's a good chance that there's some indication of trauma. Doesn't mean that there is, but that is something for us to keep our eyes on and monitor. Recognize traumatic situations when we see them. Obviously, if we do that kind of training with our staff, with the families, with the community providers that we work with, and remember that idea that if in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, there's recognition that it happened, there's validation that it was real, and that it's understandable that that would hurt, that will improve the outcomes dramatically. Consider the role of trauma, again, not allowing any disability to overshadow the impact of that. Respond with compassion, we're going to talk about that in a second. Recognizing the prevalence, implying a trauma-informed overlay. That's what I'm really calling this lens of trauma-informed care. That whatever intervention we're using, whatever way we're interacting with people, in the back and in the sides of our view, we're remembering this role that trauma plays and the ways that trauma symptoms look. That behaviors are expression of pain, fear, and resilience, and that trauma-informed care happens in a trauma-informed culture. I think that that's really important. If we can look at one another in a trauma-informed way, and we can start doing that work in our offices, in the ways we respond to one another, that doesn't mean sitting down and taking a trauma assessment with everybody. But what it means is recognizing the impact that trauma plays in all of our lives. When we're looking at the work that you all do, that's both your own story and all of the trauma that you interface with on a daily basis in your professional life. And that goes through all levels of the system. So I'm working with an agency recently, and the woman that I was working with, she kept saying, I don't really go into homes anymore. I don't really see that. I'm like 2 steps removed from that. I was like, how do you experience it? She's like, well, I do have to read through the case notes. I do have to provide supervision. I'm like, you're holding a whole bunch of trauma. So recognizing the impact of that. This is just one example of a trauma-informed response. The client says, F off, I hate you. From a trauma-informed perspective, what do you think could be the function of this statement? If we're looking at just this statement through a trauma-informed lens, what could be the motivation for that particular behavior? Anybody have any guesses?
They want us to F off?
Pretty directly. Yeah. So from a trauma-informed perspective, they could be asking for exactly what they're asking for. But this is not a riotous outburst, but that's saying, you know, potentially, I really need some space. You do not feel safe to me right now. It would be best for everybody involved if you F off. And so honoring that sometimes people are asking for exactly what they need. But if we're not listening with the trauma ear, we're just hearing anger. We're hearing like emotion, we're seeing behavior. And so we want to take it seriously from a trauma perspective. So ignoring that or pressing on with the interaction, well, that's super triggering. That's super invalidating. It's incredibly minimizing of what they have just taken courage, even though it might not look that way, to ask of us. Responding from a rule-based perspective, we've talked about that kind of language. You might need to do that later if that's, you know, not an appropriate place for that language. But in the moment, responding only in that way, once again, invalidates that they've made a request of you as somebody that they trust. So a trauma-informed response, I hear that you were upset and asking for space. It seems as though we were having a good time. What happened? That would be a later sort of processing question. But really recognizing that sometimes people, most times, people actually mean what they say in those moments. And that from a trauma-informed perspective, people know how to ask for their needs. We just haven't always been listening. So on the right-hand side, I was just, you know, again, I like pulled together a lot of different sources in terms of some proactive strategies, some reactive strategies. And you can read through these on your own, but the idea is when we're using any sort of behavioral strategies, we want to keep in mind from a trauma-informed perspective, low arousal, repeated grounding techniques. So thinking about working with somebody, and every once in a while, and for different people, this could be every 2 minutes, every 5 minutes. I one time worked with a group of people, and pretty much after every person spoke, we would do a lot of grounding activities. Play-Doh is a great one. You know, using the senses. So were things like just putting your hands on your chair, digging your feet into the ground. Sometimes people wear, you know, a bracelet or something that they can play with. A textured fabric can be really comforting and grounding. Any of those things to help people come back to the present moment should be throughout the work that we're doing with trauma survivors. We want to keep in mind interpersonally the role of attachment, and programmatically, wherever we can, providing consistency. Again, creating that culture, that trauma-informed culture, and then trying to incorporate programming, art, music, movement, drumming, dance. You don't have to be especially trained in all of those or any of those things. You know, one of the easiest things to do is to hand people a crayon, to hand people Play-Doh. One of the things that we would do in the faith group, and we did in our group, we had all people who had both use of both hands, so this could easily be adapted. We would have people put their crayon in whatever hand they've never put a crayon in before, and that takes away the pressure that they have to make something pretty, and just go at it. And then all of a sudden, the intensity of the room would go down. So providing those kinds of programming. And then reactive strategies, co-regulation, helping people to be a partner in regulating whatever the intensity of the moment is a really trauma-informed strategy, and it's something that I'm sure a lot of you are already implementing. Doing mindfulness techniques. There's a great workbook, actually. I don't know if some of you have seen it. It's from a small publisher, but it's Mindfulness Exercises for Persons with Developmental Disabilities. Have you seen that one? I don't know if that's exactly the title. But it's a great little workbook that has a ton of interventions that are really simple and really fun, that really help to bring down intensity. All right. On the back, I put together some trauma-informed treatment planning tips. This is not an exhaustive list, but I thought somewhere I should put a list of some of the more common traumatic experiences. Institutional traumas is something that so many of the people that we're working with in disability services will have experienced. And that's a really compounding factor for a lot of people's history of trauma. We want to be able to recognize those trauma symptoms and reactions. Again, trying to do the best we can with this baseline level of functioning, the ongoing assessments, and then remembering that two of the most important needs for trauma survivors are safety and control. If you've ever been in a traumatic situation, and you reflect back on it, I imagine that not a lot of you felt like you had ultimate control of what was happening. And reinstilling a sense of control is really important to helping us to get our functioning back on track. One of the questions I had at the break was about the debate of, is it still important that people be able to sort of tell their story when it comes to trauma? Is that still really important that we kind of dig out people's stories? My response is that some people think that still is important, but if we're looking from a trauma-informed brain perspective, that isn't as important. What's more important is to help people function in the present, to help them be able to respond to this activation, and to find that safety and that sense of control. And then I put, some of the different things to think about in terms of safety and control, present-centeredness, and then the recognition that traumatic memories are not stored sequentially or logically. A lot of times they're not stored verbally, even for people who have full verbal processing capabilities. And so that's why they come out the way they do, kind of come out as a garbled mess. We can access some of those things through some expressive intervention. All right. Any questions? All right, we're coming up.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Now, say you come upon a person that you know has been through trauma or abuse or whatever, but by the time you come upon them, they are now also in an active life where they're drawn towards people that where they feel they're comfortable with, they themselves be now potentially active with. So there's got to be like a whole kind of approach or intervention.
That's a great question, and I think a common scenario, and if people have other suggestions, please jump in. From my perspective, I really think about it as like the most important safety need. I have found that the conversation of you're making these choices because of this can be a trap, where, people want to defend themselves, like, well, maybe it is, but I feel good about this. And so in terms of like accepting where people are at, talking about the safety issues that they can recognize at this moment. So maybe they don't recognize these full relationships as being problematic, but maybe there are small things that they bring to your attention that they seem to be a little worried about, a little concerned about. And I think starting with those small pieces of safety will get you further than sort of jumping beyond that to talk about their history of trauma. Other people have different perspectives on that, but from sort of a present-centered approach, that's how I would think about it, is working on those, whatever safety issues are accessible to you. So in a non-judging way, whatever ones they're willing to kind of bring forward, I would start there. And I think that is a really common pattern. I mean, something else that I work with a lot is people who have perpetrated violence, who also have an incredibly dense trauma history themselves, and I think that what can be really helpful there is to acknowledge that. I think that a lot of times when I look at programs designed for people who have been charged with violent offenses or people who have been convicted of sex offenses, it's like, well, we'll just ignore the trauma because we don't want anybody to think that there's an excuse for behaving this way. But if we look at the research, what the research bears out is that we really want to make substantive changes in people's functioning, dealing with their trauma is also important. So being able to do a both and is really helpful. All right, so one of the things that we can do in our roles is also talking to other providers about trauma-informed care, whether that's family members, community members, other people working in residences. There's a friend of mine who works at an agency. It's actually like a collection of group homes. And one of the things that they did last year is they took all of their staff, every single person, and did a day-long workshop about trauma and sort of retrained from this perspective of like, this is what trauma looks like. And started having supervision, monthly or something, at each level of the service providers, just asking questions like, what are you seeing that looks like trauma? Not asking people to do any specific kinds of intervention, but just to heighten their awareness of what it looks like. And she said that the results were really interesting, that it seems to sort of bring closer together the different sort of levels of staff within the agency. That now there was this language that whether they were talking about the psychiatrist or the person who comes in and works the night shift, that there was this shared way that they could talk about some of what was going on. So explaining these basic concepts of trauma, explaining what trauma looks like, what it feels like. You can talk about Dewey, but I'm sure you can talk about your own pets too. Just giving people like a simple example of how this presents. The importance of early intervention. Basic trauma first aid, which again is really just recognizing the trauma. That's the first aid, recognizing it, and then providing empathy. I'll provide this little acronym in a second. And being present for what somebody is sharing. I think it's really important, to whatever degree is appropriate, to provide the same kind of information to the clients that we're working with, and being able to have them understand this language. So a lot of people that we used to do at Pervasive Developmental Center, we used to do training all over the place with people who might be first responders, who don't have training in how to be a first responder. So bus drivers, teachers who don't necessarily have this background, gym teachers, cross-country coaches, who might be present for some sort of a disclosure of trauma. And we talked about all the reasons why it was scary to hear that. People are worried. You know, all of a sudden you're having a conversation and somebody shares, yeah, and then my uncle did this horrible thing. Everything stops. And it feels like this is the moment. I have to say the perfect thing. Who do I have to call? Is there a pamphlet somewhere? So we, listen to their questions. What happens if it triggers me? How much detail should I ask for? What is their line? Should I ask for a question? So we came up with this little acronym, LABIT. And basically, you don't have to remember the acronym, but what you have to remember is that the way that we want to respond is the most human way possible. And the first thing to do is to take care of ourselves for just a minute. Just take a deep breath. And then we have to listen. And then we affirm, so sorry that happened. I'm listening to you. And then we have to believe. It doesn't matter if they're telling, a fabrication. In that moment, that's not our goal. Then after that is when we do stuff that might get more detail oriented. It's something we have to report. We have to get some information. If they need follow-up resources, we have to seek out those types of facts, and we handle those tasks on the end. But telling this information to the people who might be on the front lines of response or receiving this information can be really helpful, because the most important thing we have to do when we learn that somebody's experienced trauma is to believe them and to listen. We don't have to investigate in that moment. And that's really the message that we want people to have in terms of, having a trauma-informed world. That if all the people who experience trauma had somebody listen and affirm them and believe them, it would change the landscape of how people's pain is addressed in their life. The last thing I want to say, remarkably on time, is for all of you, which is the importance of taking care of you. The work that you do is so important and so meaningful, and it requires so much of you. I'm sure that there are times when you knock it out of the park at work, and you come home and your family and your friends get the leftovers. And that's such a hard way to live, and it's also such an unbelievable sacrifice that you make on a regular basis. And I think it's really important for you to affirm that in yourself and with one another, that this work is hard. And if you've been doing it 20 years, if you've been doing it 40 years, if you've been doing it 2 weeks, you all have experienced some stage of vicarious trauma. So I think it's really important that we don't talk about vicarious trauma as like what happens to the really bad employees who don't take care of themselves and don't do yoga and don't exercise 4 times a week. Vicarious trauma to me is not an if, it's a when. And just like regular trauma, it's something that we can learn skills to manage and adapt. I think it's something that, you know, is something that we'll all go through. And when we are vicariously traumatized, guess what? We look like we're traumatized. All these not pretty symptoms that we're talking about suddenly become our own. And to add that to whatever our own history of trauma is, and we need healing too. So being able to recognize those symptoms in yourself and other people, finding an accountability partner, I think is great. Actually, my accountability partner is somebody that I met at a trauma workshop years ago who lives across the country. And really the only thing that keeps us connected as friends is that we agree. We don't care how long it's been since we've written each other. We will never apologize for not returning a phone call. But when we need to like put out some information, that's when we'll access one another, and we do. And so I think finding people who can see that sort of support, because sometimes in the jobs, you know, in life getting busy, by the time you meet somebody, you feel like you've pulled away too much from your busy life to go in and ask for something. So setting up an accountability partner who you utilize in that way can be really helpful. And these are all things I'm sure you've seen before, finding small ways to stay grounded, taking real breaks, not judging what your self-care is. It's so funny because when I do self-care stuff with students, I ask them, like, what are you doing for their wellness? They're like, hiking 4 times a week, yoga every day, I eat only 4 small meals, and I drink, you know, 124 ounces of water. I'm like, okay, so none of you were just watching Netflix until that message that comes on and says, are you still watching? Nobody's doing that. Apparently not. Apparently 22-year-old students are very zen. So I think the important thing is to not judge what fills you up, but to pay attention to what fills you up. If you watch, you know, 27 hours of SVU, no judgment from me, but how good do you feel afterwards? If you walk outside, does the future look bright? And so just paying attention to what are the things that fill you up and what are the things that drain you. And you can keep that list in your own head. So the things that drain you are your best friends and your children. You need to keep that to yourself, but you know that balancing that with something that really fills you up can be really helpful. People who are non-vicariously traumatized are the best resources for their clients and communities. And so this is not something we do if we have time. This is something that we have to do to keep ourselves ready for this work and to do for one another. All right, so here's some resources. Again, if you want my long resource list, I'm happy to email to you. So you can just email me at the address in the slides. I've done the best job that I can throughout the slides to cite where my information is coming from, but I have been to a lot of presentations over the years where I've just kind of ended up with a handout, and I'm not necessarily sure of the sources, but I'm happy to send you PDFs. I mean, just let me know how big your inbox is, and I'll fill up. Yes.
I know Valerie's not here, but if you send it to Valerie, she'll put it on the website.
Okay, great.
She always does.
Great. I will be in touch with Valerie and see if I can get some more resources up there. These are the printed resources. I think that, you know, if you're in a position where you're coordinating a staff, getting a copy of each of these, if you have a little bit of extra room in the budget, people can check them out and it can be really helpful. There are so many online resources and trainings that are free and are available. These are some of the ones that I found to be really, really helpful. There's a lot of different states. It sounds like, you know, Val has some big ideas for more trainings in Massachusetts, so I know she'll be on top of it. But places who have just offered tons of trauma information. I didn't put them up here either, but also on YouTube, there are great presentations with all of these authors, and I just find them wonderful to listen to. Most of them have nicer voices than me, so a little more soothing. But there are just so many good resources out there, and so I hope that you'll dive into them and then let me know what things are helpful to you. I'm always looking to learn more and to expand my resources. And with that, I will open it up to any questions, comments, wisdom, advice, funny stories that you all want to share before we wrap up. Yes.
I'm just thinking, like, in a group home setting or a day setting, and keeping kind of HIPAA in kind of your mind. How do you really determine how much is too much for the direct care staff? What amount of information do they need to know when they start working?
Well, I can tell you how I've handled this, and I'm sure that there are many different ways. So my perspective is that once you've provided this sort of trauma-informed lens, then it can be much easier to identify these are trauma triggers that we've noticed, these are trauma symptoms that we've noticed, and the story becomes much less important. So if I say, I've noticed, several people have reported that in working with Max, it's really important that he, always have access to his sock or something, or whatever it is. And what we recognize is that him being barefooted is a real trigger for some trauma reactions. So if we provided the training on this is what trauma is, this is what it does, it kind of echoes that idea that instead of feeling like each type of trauma has to be treated in a specific way, not that there aren't differences in special considerations, if we focus really on those symptoms and those triggers, then that's an easy way to communicate needs without feeling like you're getting into the abyss of HIPAA, which is stressful. Yeah. Anybody have any other thoughts on that question?
Yeah. It's just, I like the presentation that you did, and I think trauma does exist for every person. And I think when we recognize that, I think the world will probably be a better place in just looking at that. But one of the things that we just have to always be sensitive to is with our direct care staff and our individuals. They're there as a new hire, probably a week in the job, and they're already doing personal care for our individuals.
Yeah.
We talk about trauma and how that can affect our individuals. It's that sensitivity that I think we really have to instill in our staff people, in our agencies, and our providers. That and I'm not saying I can correct it. I know it is the reality that we have to deal with, but we have the sensitivity of understanding that a lot of our individuals have gone through trauma, and here we are having a new person bathe them or take care of them. And sometimes it's bathing of opposite sex too, because we don't have staffing to do that. So we concerned about that.
That's such a great point. It reminds me of a few years back. I was working. I was doing supervision for providers in a group home, and it was in this moment that I switched my language from if to when it came to things like being personally reactivated, personally reminded of our, some of our own traumatic experiences, because I think that that's another part of it when we look at those direct care workers who are coming in, like you said, to this very high demand job, entering a very personal space, and then the people who haven't done so well with their boundaries are talked about as like the negative case. When at one point, those negative cases were new people starting off who also wanted to do a good job. And so I think recognizing from the front end that people will have their own experiences and reactivity and where people can get those needs met, and the sensitivity of the situation. I think being proactive in that way is really important. Because I think, at HCC we have the direct care support certificate, and those two advices that I have that are in my program who've been working for a long time, and we're talking about how meaningful their work is to them, and how in different places they felt more or less appreciated for the big job that they have. And so I think being able to emphasize that is really important.
And when I go back to my office, I'm really going to tell providers, are they doing this presentation or something like this right at the beginning of staff's employment, so that they have the sensitivity to understand that trauma does exist for a lot of our individuals. They've been in various situations where they may have been traumatized with having that sensitivity.
Yeah, and like I was mentioning, my friend who started that shift in her agency, her thinking was that trauma for a long time was sort of like the purview of psychiatrists and medical professionals, and it didn't, you know, but really the information is so accessible. Like the basics of it make so much sense, and so she's had some good luck with doing that. It's the first day of orientation for new hires that are so yeah. All right, anything else? Please feel free if you have any questions. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you.